thank you everyone for joining us today on behalf of AAM and EdCom for this Google Hangout chat. We're looking for hopefully conversation. Today's chat is titled Discussing Identity, Bias, Privilege, and Diversity in the Museum Field. And we're looking to touch upon these topics, think about ways that we can respond as museum practitioners, and sort of just continue a necessary dialogue. Some of the main questions that we will be covering today include how our involvement in museums is influenced by our identity, how we've been marginalized or benefited within museum field because of identity factors, how it's reflected in museums, that will come up. Before we go further, I should introduce myself. My name is Mark Osterman. I am part of EdCom. I also work for the Sky Museum and Gardens. I have a series of panelists who are joining me today, whom I'll introduce in a few moments. Just want to go over a few tech issues with a colleague of mine, and also just remind those who are participating, you can follow us on Twitter at #MuseumEdChat. And so before I get deeper into things, Tim, can I hand it over to you to just go over some tech issues?
Absolutely. So my name is Tim Rue. I'm the Communications Chair for EdCom, so thank you all for joining us again. I just wanted to let you guys all know that we are looking forward to your questions as we go forward today, and we'd just like to help give you some instructions on how to provide those to us. So I should be sharing a little screen here for everyone. You will see if on the top right of your screen a series of 9 little white boxes. Looks a little bit like a Rubik's Cube right there. If you click on that, you might need to move your mouse up there, but if you click on that, you'll see this Q&A and Showcase button show up. If you click on the Q&A, you'll have a box show up where you can type in your questions. If you'll see other people's questions there as well, feel free to give a +1 to any question you like. They will up the queue, and we'll know which questions are most popular so that we can make sure we answer those. But please ask your questions and enjoy the rest of today's discussion. And join us in at the discussion on Twitter again. That's at #MuseumEdChat. I'll give it back to Mark.
Great. Thank you, Tim. So before we move forward, I just want to give some context into what kind of motivated us to get this Google Hangout going. So issues of identity, bias, privilege, and diversity, they've sort of exploded over the past few years across society, and it's just a consensus that the museum field has really struggled how to respond, both internally when we think about staffing structure, hiring practices, but also externally when we think about programs, exhibitions, and different forms of community engagement. So we're hoping today to sort of add to this discussion and think about ways that the museum field can respond in meaningful ways. A few ongoing things that have been happening in the museum field and that connect to AAM. Within these issues, I just wanted to bring up that, again, serviced as inspiration to get this hangout going, but also get the particular panelists involved with this program. They include the AAM 2016-2020 strategic plan that lists as one of the core values, access and inclusivity. Also, an area of focus of that strategic plan is diversity, equity, accessibility, and inclusion in all aspects of museum structure and programming. This is furthered also by the Trends Watch 2016, produced by the Center for the Future of Museums. There's a particular section there called Capture the Flag that goes over the struggle over representation and identities in museums. Also just bringing up some sessions that took place at AAM 2015 and 2016. In 2015, Museum Workers Speak held a rogue session to consider how museums might turn the social justice lens inward. That had quite an impact. So that went from holding a single rogue session in 2015 in 2016 with an official conference session, a breakfast, and a discussion at the Center for the Future of Museums demo on museums and labor. Monica Montgomery, one of our panelists, is a key representative of Museum Workers Speak, and she'll have an opportunity to address that group and their initiatives. Lastly, I'll just mention things that are becoming obvious, some sort of quantifiable data to these issues. The Association of Art Museum Directors devoted its meeting in May 2016 to diversity and inclusion. The AAMD ran a survey in 2015 of 181 museums and found that only 4% of curators, educators, conservators, and top administrators are either African American at 6%, or Asian I'm sorry, I lost that percentage, and 3% Hispanic. Basically just really outlining not a very inclusive and diverse environment. And so lastly, when we were conceptualizing, well, what are we going to do? How are we going to create this conversation? I fortunately came across the work of Frank Fagnone, who, amongst many other initiatives, has his water cooler chats. And so once I came across these and some of the conversations he had specifically with Angel Hernandez, Monica Montgomery, it seemed like a great forum to expand on those discussions, in some ways replicate them, and bring them to a larger audience. So that's sort of the focus for today. And before I hand it over to Frank, I just want to do a brief introduction of our panelists. And I'll read these very short bios. There is a resource page that I believe is connected to this Hangout, and I can ask Tim to elaborate on that at the end, that has full bios and other resources. But beginning with Frank Fagnone is a public historian with over 25 years of leadership in nonprofit management. Frank consults, lectures, teaches internationally. He maintains a blog, The Twisted Preservation, the series One Night Stand, Overnights in Historic Homes, and online water cooler chats. In addition, we have Monica Montgomery, who is an international speaker, museum director, and cultural entrepreneur. Monica is the co-founder and strategic director of Museum Hue, a multicultural collective advancing professionals of color in arts, culture, museums, and creative economy. She's also the founding director of Museum of Impact. Monica also works, as mentioned before, with Museum Workers Speak. And lastly, we have Angel Hernandez, who is the Director of Programs and External Relations for the Bronx County Historical Society. He's a native of the Bronx with a passion to unearth historic information of his hometown. He's also director for the Bronx Latino History Project, which is a research project that studies Latinos who have lived or contributed to Bronx history. So without wasting much more time and trying to get deep into our impactful discussion, I'm going to hand it over to Frank. And Frank, if you can just begin to provide us with a little background on the water cooler chats, how they got started, and what's your goal for conducting these types of interviews?
Sure. First, thank you so much for asking me to moderate today, and I'm humbled by being here with my friends talking about this really difficult issue. Starting the water cooler chats really came out from my consulting nationally, and having all of these great conversations over dinner, over drinks, during strategic planning and think tank meetings. And what I felt like was that I was lucky enough to be getting all of this great guidance and suggestion from my friends that I really wanted to take it to a much wider audience, because I was hearing such amazing suggestions, and I always ended my conversation, well, what is something we can do right now? Because I tend to be, and Monica and Angel know this, I tend to be a person who's like, what can I do right now? Rather than kind of thinking and talking about it forever and ever. So that's how water cooler chats started, and my goal is to really make us all feel far more comfortable in talking about these issues, and difficult issues for different reasons for different kinds of people. And so that's the reason why I started water cooler chats. And I just keep plugging along, trying to find interesting people who can give me a variation of ideas, because one thing I'm realizing already is there is no one single idea about what this diversity issue is in museums. And so that's what keeps propelling me doing these water cooler chats.
Great. Thank you, Frank. And as I said, I found them really provocative. So did many other colleagues in EdCom, so we're excited to have you involved. I'm going to hand it over to you to get into some interesting stuff with Monica and Angel, okay?
Sure, and I know we will because I know these two. And for those of you that's been on the website and listened to the water cooler chats, we all know that I start with this crazy question, which is, and Monica, I'll start with you. So how do you self-identify? Give me those categories about how you would describe yourself.
Let me unmute. So I identify in a plethora of ways, but most essentially as an unapologetically Black woman who is a connector, a creative disruptor, and a leader in my own right. Without a title, without institutional validation, I lead and I help and I connect people. And I represent so many organizations right now. It's appalling. Museum Hue, Museum Workers Speak, Muse Black, all of these intersectional groups, Museums Respond to Ferguson, that I represent, that are with me here, and I'm going to be answering on behalf of myself and them today.
Got it. Now, Angel, how would you describe and kind of self-identify?
Well, I'm from the South Bronx. I'm a Puerto Rican American. Just like Monica, I'm a sort of a troublemaker. I'm always pushing the envelope.
Is that why we're friends?
That's why we always enjoy our time together.
Click.
But I'm also a historian, a Bronx historian, a New York City historian. I am a strong Latino, educated, and I am a product of my neighborhood, my environment. And I'm also an educator. I work with kids. I work with all types of students. And any opportunity for me to talk about my experience in the museum world, I always accept and honored to discuss.
And I love to talk with you about it. We're going to jump right in because one of the reasons why AM is interested in us being involved here is that they know that we're going to talk openly and honestly. So I'll jump right in, and I'll go back to you, Angel. Given those categories, given being a Puerto Rican from the Bronx, how has that affected your involvement in the museum and cultural field? Have you ever felt bias in what you wanted to do in terms of education or programming, any of that?
Well, the Bronx County Historical Society was founded in 1955, and the people here, we have people in their capacity for 40, almost 50 years. These people have been running Poe Cottage since 1975, when the Bronx, well, New York City in general, was going through fiscal crisis. We all know what happened in the Bronx in the late 60s, going into the 80s. And there was a lot of fear, there was a lot of reluctance with the ideas I had. When I started in 2009, I saw a lot of opportunity for programming. And not just for programming, but outreach, reaching out to people that live in the Bronx today. So at first, I did experience some resistance, some pushback. They thought I was just too energetic. I didn't know what I was getting into. But, and you know this, Frank, very well. There was a lot of pushback. But I think with the merit, with the success, I gained that trust. I mean, Poe Cottage, it was built in 1812. It's where the poet last lived his life. We also have another museum called the Museum of Bronx History at the Valentine Variant House. That's 1758. That's the second oldest house in the Bronx. So when I asked if I can do a beer garden event for Bronx Week, it was a big whoa. But it was one of the best things we did at the museum because it opened it up to the to the community. People loved it, and they want to do it again.
But
so,
Angel, do you have many people you know of Latino descent who are in the museum field?
Unless I go to El Museo del Barrio.
Yeah.
But I'm a rare.
And that's something, and I'm going to switch over to Monica and ask the same question, but that's something I want all of us to think about, because that 3% of people that are Latino or African American involved in museums, that's at a leadership position. It does grow to like 23, 26% when you consider security guards and maintenance workers. And of course, that's not where we want to keep the diversity. Now, Monica, I'd like to switch over to you and ask, how have the categories that you listed affected your involvement in the museum field?
You know, it's interesting because I have been simultaneously marginalized but also favored, and this weird blend is happening now. So Museum Q, which is an organization I co-founded, is a collective of Black and Brown and Latino and Caribbean and Asian and First Nation and LGBTQAI folks that are holding space for ourselves in the museum sector that previously didn't really give us space. And we kind of kicked in the door, and now we're bending the field to our will to understand and affirm our presence. So there is a lack of people of color in leadership. I'm personally trying to change that, but we are not hard to find when it comes to people that want to be in museums. I was on a panel at AAM this last year called We're Not Hard to Find. Folks that want to be in museums, lead in museums, work, and attend museums, we're here, and you just have to know the communities to connect with us in.
Now, so for both of you, it's interesting. Angel, have you felt the same kind of preferential treatment, the kind of opposite of bias because of your Latino descent?
Yes, yes. At first I thought, oh, am I a token? You know, am I that, you know, special Puerto Rican? But there's an advantage because, as you know, demographics in the Bronx, more than half of the population are Latinos. Puerto Ricans are the oldest Latinos in the borough. So I felt like my presence, you know, what I was presenting at the museums and at the society in general, people were listening because it's the demographics, it's the people of the Bronx today. So since I started doing these walking tours in Hunts Point, in the hood, you know, there's more attention, you know, going on Facebook. People are loving it, and it's not just your older, you know, Bronxite from Westchester, Jew or Irish or whatever. Yeah. It's everyone, but a lot are Latinos. So at first I thought, hey, am I being hired just, you know, to color it up? But later on I thought, there is an advantage. There is an advantage, and I have to
jump in really quick. Angel, can I say something really quick? I think there is this fetishization of people of color, especially around Ethnic Heritage Month, or if there's a diversity quotient to meet where they'll hire you, they'll bring you in, they'll say, hey, run this Black History Month, Latino History Month event. But then when you're no longer needed, you're often discarded or you're the only one, and they never planned a real strategy around what you're about.
Right.
And I just want to address that because one thing that I'm hearing over and over again in the water cooler chats, and I'd be interested in both of your opinions on it, is that, my friend Elon Cook used the term ghettoizing these kinds of programs, and whether it's for the month or it's a kind of African-American program, Latino history program, it's always kind of the other. And I agree with you, Monica, and I'm hearing it a lot that, that what really needs to happen is this full immersion of a kind of philosophic shift in cultural organizations, that we need to just understand that Black history is history and Latino history is history, and it needs to be fully integrated. You both talk with me about how you see that.
Should I? Oh. Well, yeah, you know, that term is interesting, ghettoized. I mean, you know, there were ghettos before Puerto Ricans and Blacks came. You know, Jews had ghettos, you know, in the Lower East Side and Harlem, Italians as well. So you know, that, I don't know about that term. What I do know is, Frank, I'm with you. I like integration. Everything is history. I mean, I graduated with a sociology degree. It's a study of people. People make history. So I don't see it as ghettoizing anything. I just see it as a full integration. Like Puerto Ricans and Blacks, we're just as part of the fabric as our predecessors before. So I'm just doing what I need to do as a historian, disseminating information the way I get it, but including everyone, you know, not just talking about the Grand Concourse and the heyday of the 1950s. You know, one problem I saw when I started here at the Society is everything stops in the 1950s when everything was golden and, you know, clean and whatnot before they came. And then there's this big gap, and all of a sudden we're talking about the Bronx in the 1990s. I'm like, wait a minute, you know, we're missing a big piece here. And that piece was us. That's, you know, when my mom came from Puerto Rico, when she saw the Bronx going down in the 60s and 70s. That's also Bronx history. A lot of historians consider that sociology. I'm like, wait a minute, you know, history continues. History is what happens 5 minutes ago. So I run into that issue a lot, but as I say, I'm the troublemaker, you know, and I'm always opening my mouth
Yeah, I got it. I got it. Now, Monica, what do you think of that question about kind of fully immersing these institutions into an understanding of all peoples?
Sure. I do think there needs to be a kind of diaspora understanding of people of color within museums, and it shouldn't just be in ethnically specific museums. I'm really interested in audiences, and more than diversity, which I think is a catchphrase, I'm really interested in inclusion, which is an intentional, holistic approach to making people of color and difference, centering their stories and their presence in museums. So I don't feel like it has to be something that's like, oh, we're going to do this thing for this month. I think it needs to be like a mainstreaming, if you will.
No, and I agree. And I just also, as we're talking, and as we keep getting deeper and deeper, I want to remind everyone to ask some questions. And earlier, the explanation was how you can ask questions, and those will be given to me, and I'll be able to kind of transfer those to the rest of the panelists. So one thing that I hear a lot, and interestingly, I've often felt in the audience being the person that the finger was being pointed to, the kind of older white man. Usually they say straight white man, but since I'm gay, that is not the case with me. But the older white man who's in a leadership position tends to be the one who is able to move inclusion, and I'll use your word, Monica, or not. Let's talk a little bit about institutions, leadership, real staffing, and ways that we can bring about this kind of inclusion very quickly. Let's go back to you, Monica, since you brought up the word inclusion.
Yes, well, inclusion is everyone's word, but I am happily to champion it. I think we can't just keep talking about diversity and inclusion. I'm so tired of committees and task forces, which I sit on, which you sit on, which lead to a 5-point plan and an amazing white paper and feasibility study, but no action. What is happening here? It's not that hard to hire people of color. It's not that hard to bring people of color into institutions. It's not that hard to dismantle white supremacist thinking and to realize that there's a larger world out there that is very diverse and colorful. So that's one thing that needs to change. I think that we have to make it part of the DNA of our personal practice so it radiates into our institutions instead of thinking we'll do this committee on Thursdays at 4 to 5 p.m. That's just not going to work. It's not going to change systems that are entrenched.
Angel, what about your perspective on organizations, leadership, employment, staffing?
I mean, as I mentioned before, you know, there's people here, you know, the leader here, he's been here for 40 years. You know, for many, many years, going back to the 1970s. And it should be normalized. You know, we shouldn't categorize anything here. I had a conversation with a historic house, and I was talking about that. Hey, you need some bilingual tours. And they're like, well, you know, we don't have anyone, but I noticed that the person in the gift shop was Dominican. And I thought, hey, why don't you train that guy? You know, on the tours. He's here for hours, you know, on the weekend. I'm pretty sure he knows the script. There is a written script. Why do you still have this white volunteer in the house where you have this young, able Dominican inside the gift shop interacting with people, you know, on an hourly basis? Why don't you switch that role and see how that works?
And why do you think that is, Angel?
I don't know. I don't know. There's a lot ingrained here, you know, and it could be that. And when I say that, it's what if he doesn't know, or what if he acts a certain way? And I said, hey, this guy is young, he's able, he's smart. I've spoken to him many times. So it should be normalized. We shouldn't categorize. We shouldn't say, okay, we're going to, as Monica says, you know, there shouldn't be a month for this or that. Everything should be normalized. It should be mainstreamed.
One thing that I hear a lot on the water cooler chats from people who are in leadership positions is there's real question as to where to go, where to literally distribute the job descriptions. And Monica, you know that I send you a lot of job descriptions because I know one of the things that you do is to get those job descriptions out to people of color. What's your response when someone in a leadership position says, someone of color's not interested in coming to this site, someone of color's not interested in telling these stories? What's your response to that?
That's a fallacy and a lie from the pit of hell. People of color are so willing, able, interested, and brilliant to be in museum cultural spaces, the first thing they could do is come to Museum Q. They can email museumq@gmail.com or museumq.com, because we distribute job and fellowship opportunities to our network of thousands of job seekers of color. And we specialize in multicultural markets, so that's the first thing they could do. Second off, don't just assume putting something online is really distributing it. Let's go back to the days when we used to do hitting the ground and putting things on, you know, community bulletin boards, or we would go and speak to a group of people, or even job fairs. Why can't there be art and culture job fairs for our sector? There's so much more that we could and should be doing.
And Angel, you already brought up the issue of multiple languages. I mean, you know, it was one thing that I kept saying all the time is, well, and you know this, Monica, when we were advertising for things at Latimer House, I insisted on getting translations in Mandarin Chinese and putting it in Mandarin Chinese forms of distribution. Talk a little bit about, in the Bronx, Angel, the necessity and possible ways that people could engage Latinos or people of color for things in the cultural field.
Well, for example, going back to Edgar Allan Poe, you know, this white poet, you know, that a lot of people, especially Latinos that live in the area, don't know about until they see me and I open my mouth and I start speaking Spanish. So it's all about programming and outreach. Frank, you were there a couple of years back when we did a show at the National Arts Club called South.
It was excellent. It was amazing.
Right, you know, and I got a Puerto Rican poet. Her name was La Bruja, and she was there reciting Edgar Allan Poe stuff with a salsa, with a merengue, and people loved it. She did it.
It was great.
Exactly. It was pushing the envelope. I'm planning on a hip hop type of concept where I might just go up and start spitting some rhymes, you know, Annabelle Lee and whatnot.
That's
it's all
fantastic.
about talking to the community. You know, bringing this old, dead white poet into context, into today's context. We also started an audio tour at the cottage where I have people who are reading Annabelle Lee in Spanish and the Cask of Amontillado.
Yeah.
Almost everyone has a cell phone, okay? I mean, from all economic levels, and they could just simply walk in and hear this stuff in Spanish.
And Angel, Monica, I want to expand our conversation a bit, because all of us are aware that it's not just the color of your skin or the language that you speak or where your place of origin is. When we start to talk about LGBTQ populations, I mean, you know, we're not talking possibly of something that you can visually see. Also, people with disabilities. I mean, perhaps if you're in a wheelchair, you're going to be able to see that disability, but I'm also dyslexic, and it's very difficult for me to read text boxes. And, you know, that's just one example of the broader understanding of inclusion. So in this conversation, I'd be really interested in how you would see involving a larger community, not just ones that are, for instance, African American or Latino.
Right. Well, two things. We just got awarded some funds by the Bronx Borough President, Ruben Diaz, who's a friend of ours, and he is paying for us to start a digitization project. That word always gets me. And we want to have an online database where I can upload virtual tours of the houses, of both of our houses, have a lot more visual stuff that people can access from all over the world. Also, on October 29th, I am hosting a program at the Poe Cottage called From Poe's Porch. And this allows poets from all over the city to use the porch of this landmark historical house as a stage to talk about those type of issues, Frank. Issues in the LGBT community. Issues that have to do with guns, with AIDS, with disease, stuff that is affecting us today as Bronxites, and also not too far from what Poe experienced. He experienced tuberculosis. He was poor as well.
Yep.
Poe Cottage is located in one of the poorest districts in the Bronx, and the Bronx itself is one of the poorest districts in the country. So I am constantly thinking about these programs and how I can talk to all types of groups besides the ethnic ones.
And Angel, everybody on this call most likely understands that Angel's had an educator who took ill, and Angel has to take an already pre-planned tour. So Angel, I wanted to give you the opportunity of kind of summarizing before you had to leave our chat today some thoughts on this discussion.
Well, you know, I was reading this article that was shared to me before, The Sugar-Coated Language of White Fragility. And what struck to me was the last line here, and what she ended off, and it's funny, I just walked away with the last line. Stop trying to be good people and start trying to be real people. I think the more real we are, the more we can get the mission, we can get our message out. Let's stop being scared to talk about certain things. Let's stop being scared about including other type of groups, because the houses, and I speak for the society, belongs to the people. We have to make these museums part of the community. This is not my house that I've been running for 40 or 80 years or whatever the case may be. It's still part of the people. Your oldest piece in your collection, that rifle going back to 1743, that belongs to the Puerto Rican that lives in the South Bronx today. That belongs to anyone who lives in the projects. That is part of their history. So we have to start opening up and sharing our precious resources and not be scared about it, and let's just be real about it as well.
All right, thank you, Angel. Thank you so much for taking some time and speaking with us.
Thank you, Frank. Thank you, everyone, for including me on this great chat, and I hope I'll see everyone soon.
All right, great, thanks. Monica, I want to switch over to you to give you a chance to talk about the issue of a wider audience, not just people of color or people of different languages, how we can start to include them in that community that we've been talking about.
Sure. I think diversity certainly speaks to all of these different identities. And it's about how we're developing audiences, how we're welcoming them in. I have this tagline in my email signature that I'm about creating embracing spaces in museums. And I think that applies to everyone from every background. So on a basic level, this issue that has recently come up about bathrooms, right? Yeah. Why are we policing where people go to bathrooms? As long as they wash their hands, they're good. You know, make it so that there's different options. However people identify, they can use the bathroom that suits them, or a non-gendered bathroom. Simultaneously having programs that reflect the lived experiences of LGBTQAI people, of people from different socioeconomic backgrounds, of elders, of youngers. It's so important to make that part of programming and exhibits and the visitor experiences when we're talking about our museum.
So let's talk a little bit about when people say, for instance, a historic site is not about diversity or inclusion. It's really about the narrative, and the narrative is about, let's just say, I'm making this up, George Washington or some other thing that has traditionally at that site been an almost exclusively white narrative. What's a response that is thoughtful to that comment?
They should read The Anarchist Guide to Historic House Museums, written by Frank Bagnone. This is why you're my mentor.
And Deb Ryan.
And Deb Ryan, and all of the fantastic literature that's been written around dismantling and taking the gaze away from the white patriarchal hero and looking at the rest of the interpretation, the rest of the house, the other people that existed at that time. That's what we did at Latimer House, and that's what can continue to be done in historic houses and beyond.
But let's also talk about there was a very public article, I think it was in the American Conservative, about a woman with her homeschooled child who went to Montpelier and Monticello, and she was responding to the amount of narrative related to the slave issues and the slavery legacy, and she was saying that that's not why they went there. And then there was also something that I posted, which was a response to that, which was that you have no idea how fully integrated this slave narrative was at, for instance, Montpelier. There were 4 white people and around 200 and something African American enslaved. What's your response when someone will come out publicly with that kind of statement when people are trying to produce a kind of broader narrative inclusion?
I think it's a very narrow and myopic view, and that it shatters her sense of self and probably threatens her, so the white fragility term would apply there too. So all of the people that lived on that estate in various states of freedom and non-freedom should be reflected and can be discussed. And in this current era of social justice and all of the emotionally fraught things that are happening with our policing system and criminal justice, more than ever we need to talk about Black lives in all of its glory and the ways that they were or were not affirmed. So that is part of the story and should continue to be.
Now, in terms of leadership, you know, a big question for me is always, you know, I've seen people trying to put together more inclusive narratives with an all-white staff. You know, talk to me a little bit about how you see the necessity for bringing in a lot of different voices at a very serious, substantive, and paid level in our museums.
Sure. Well, I've been recently doing a lot of consulting around diversity and inclusion and how to do that work, and I've been coming up with some just really radical ideas inspired by the business sector. I think that we need to have a one-to-one model, right? For every one white, privileged, well-paid museum director, curator, registrar, we need to set aside a pot of money to hire one person of color or made one unpaid internship into a paid internship or a thriving wage job. I think we have to do that and think of it as this is the only way it's going to work. We can't keep talking it. We have to continue these hiring practices that affirm that. I think also just in terms of advising the museum about its process and being community-minded, we need to have this community advisory capacity in all of our doings. Not just, again, trotting it out for the grants, but in every single decision, there should be a community advisory capacity that's giving us insight into what the community needs are. That's so important.
You know, as a leader in museums, and specifically historic house museums, I always became frustrated because I wanted more inclusive boards. I wanted the staff to be representative of the community. And after years of these committees, as you're joking about, I finally just said, well, if I don't do it, who will? And if now's not the time, when is the right time? And so I just started going in that direction, and that's really one of the reasons why you and I became involved, because I knew of the work that you were doing, and I knew that you were able to bring a very important voice to everything that was happening in the organization. I think most people who are not the leaders in the organizations feel kind of the way we're talking about. And their real struggle and frustration is how to get those higher-ups moving in this direction. And I always kind of say that is education. What's your response?
Well, I think it's a variety of things, right? And so getting more people of color involved in, you mean in a staff capacity, right?
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
So I think it's really looking for them and being committed to having a diversity higher quotient at the very least, and not just talking it but living it. But I think it's looking at the museum studies programs, looking outside of museum studies programs. My partner Stephanie Cunningham of Museum Hue wrote an article about casting a wider net, and I wrote a diversity article as well about how you can look for people that would thrive in this atmosphere without demanding a certain degree or demanding that you went to this Ivy League school or that you had this amount of years of museum experience, because that's elitist and that's exclusionary, and it keeps lots of people of color out of that equation. So thinking of, do you really need to have these certain standards for hiring a position? And then including people like myself. I didn't go to school for a museum. I went to school for marketing. And that has served me so well in a variety of careers.
Architecture,
marketing. I tell you that I've had so many jobs. Before being in museums, I was a classroom educator. And when I wanted to transition, people actively said, you shouldn't be here. You worked in the classroom. You'll never get it in museum ed. You'll never go anywhere. People actively discouraged me from pursuing this path. So that's why my fierce determination is here to empower myself and all of my peers to say, we belong here. We're not hard to find. We have the capacity to lead if we're given those opportunities.
And Monica, and I know that one of the questions we got is about internships, and it's something you and I have talked about, and it's something I've been really dedicated to. I've also had a conversation with Gretchen Soren, who is the leader of the Cooperstown Graduate Program, about bringing in that diversity even at the internship level, but also in academia. Bringing in diversity is easier at the intern level, except that right now there's this great struggle that organizations say they don't have the money to actually pay interns. Now, I realize that's a different discussion. right, about whether you pay interns or not. But I also, in New York City, realized that we had already been censoring who could even apply to internships because you had to afford to live in New York City. And so
Right.
talk to me how you feel about that in ways that we can assist, even at the intern level, this issue of inclusion.
I think number one, from my the organization Museum Workers Speak, which is a collective of us that are advocating for labor equity in museums and cultural institutions, we have to think about why are budgets so tight when it comes to interns? Why, when there's a star artist or a public program, money is a little more free-flowing, but when it comes to someone's labor, we don't value it enough to assign at least a Metro card or an honorarium. So we have to challenge and push back on that. Oh, there's no budget for it, because that's the classic nonprofit line. I think bringing in people of color at a very basic level, like going into high schools, like all these organizations that have the teen nights and they have teens that are in their museums, the Brooklyn Museum, the Met. Let's think of how we can get those teens envisioning themselves as arts workers in a healthy arts ecosystem and starting to give them incentive to pursue this path. So going below the college level and seeing who else can do this work. And I just generally feel that most leaders can encourage people in ways that don't necessarily cost a lot of money, but using their presence and using their knowledge, people can be mentored and apprenticed to learn the sector in an alternative way than an internship.
And we got a question from Twitter, and it's really about resources. I mean, it makes me think of one of the first business consultants that I pulled in when I started running nonprofits said that priorities are reflected in the budget. And every time that I do a budget, I tell myself that the organization's priorities are reflected in the budget. And the question is, how do institutions decide how these resources are being shared and what programs and for what communities are being looked at to spend this money? And I'll say, from my perspective, and I'll use the Latimer House as an example, where Monica and I have been working together on it for a number of years. That community is 85% Mandarin-speaking, first and second generation Chinese, and the legacy is this extraordinarily important African-American inventor legacy. And so when we started the project, and I want you to jump here, Monica, we had these two different communities with very different ideas and needs. And so that's how we decided where resources were going. Talk a little bit about that, because you were action director of the Latimer House, so you and I worked kind of intensely on that.
I mean, I can't speak for all institutions. I can only speak for mine. I think a lot of times resources are doled out according to the perceived value of a department. So a lot of times curatorial will get a lot of resources, but the education department has to make do. And so often, can we just talk for a second about departments and the interdepartmental dynamics? Education.
No, I'm going to stop you, Monica.
Coming to this discussion as a museum educator at heart, my start was in museum education and now I'm a director. We do so much to affirm the institution. We're doing outreach, we're doing programming, we're talking to kids, we're talking to adults, we're like, kissing babies. Like, we're doing all of these things as educators and don't get a lick of credit and don't get any more funding than before. So I just want to shout out museum educators and the work that they do. But I'm not really sure what determines institutional priorities on funding. I know for me, I was always interested in what the public is going to see. So we had the multilingual interpretation and other things like that, but I don't really know how the big guys make their decisions. I don't.
Yeah. Well, being in a leadership position for several decades, I will say it is this tightrope walk between funding, funders, the board's expectations,
right,
and then what, for instance, I, as a kind of museum professional, feel like the organization's direction should be. That's a really difficult place, and that's one of the reasons why you and I kept having lunch, because I would say, so Monica, what do you think? Remember? Monica, what do you think of this? And you go, well, I think we need to go into social justice. And I'm like, that's great. We're going to go into social justice. I mean,
right,
in my mind, priorities need to be malleable, because one person can't really understand the full spectrum of what the possibility is. You
Yes,
know?
yes. I would like to switch gears for a moment, Frank.
Yeah.
One of the questions that was originally asked was, how is the cultural and social privilege reflected in museums? And I'd like to speak about an article that came out that was recently shocking and offensive to me and many of my colleagues. So there was an amazing intersectional exhibit called Crosslines that happened back in May in Washington, D.C. at the Smithsonian Arts and Industries Building, curated by Adriel Lewis and other of his colleagues at the APA Smithsonian. And so it brought together 40 artists and all these different art forms and really tackled social justice and intersectionality for people of color. So the other day I was reading this blog called The DCist, and it looks like the Arts and Industries Building, which was kind of laying dormant, now has a director. Her name is Rachel Goslin, and she said that part of her goal is to activate the space of the building and to do things that will take the Smithsonian into this future direction. But she made this quote that was the essence of why this talk is needed. She said, arts and scientists made a fine backdrop for Crosslines, which was built as a culture lab on intersectionality. But I hope to preserve a lot of the Crosslines energy with a slightly more polished tone for a consistent visitor experience.
Slap down.
This is why there's struggles, right? So
Yeah.
last night, the Tweet Chat Museums Respond to Ferguson, which happens on Wednesdays and has been going on consistently the last 2 years, that's helmed by Adrian Russell and Aaliyah Brown, talked about polished tones. And why is it that Crosslines was perceived as unpolished when they had record attendance, all sorts of engagement, they tackled social justice, but because it wasn't the traditional conservative static exhibit about European art, it wasn't highly regarded. And some folks from Twitter really clapped back and fought against this, and they said, we thought that Crosslines had incredible work, and that if that's not polished, then museums aren't ready. And I just want to get your feedback on when people say things about polish, how do you perceive it as a white male leader in the museum sector?
You know, it is something that I've often thought about because the expectations from the museum field are exactly what you're saying. This notion of polished could very well be considered a kind of wording that means standard, traditional, white idea of what excellence is. Now, that's not to say that a multicultural exhibit can't have excellence in it. It's most likely going to have a different perspective about what that excellence is. And so for me, again, it's quite simply, as a leader, it's my responsibility to keep surrounding myself with people who can educate me about this kind of ever-evolving experience that is the museum field. You know, I mean, just today, Cordell Reeves, our friend Cordell Reeves, sent me the article about the Museum of Lynchings that is being proposed in Alabama.
I saw that.
And so this is a really powerful idea. This person has been collecting soil from lynchings across the country, and those soil deposits will be the kind of basis for this memorial/museum, which will be about enslavement all the way up through mass incarceration. I happen to think that that's a really powerful, yes, difficult subject. I think everybody would say that's a difficult subject. But then you read down some of those comments, and some of those comments are still coming from the same place of privilege, the same place of questioning whether or not this is... Yeah, so it's a scary kind of position to be in, a person in leadership needing to, who understands that's necessary, the kind of evolution of institutions, but have so many pressures from people to actually not let institutions evolve.
And exhibits like Crosslines and museums like the one that's being started is what inclusion is about. It's what diversity is about. It is the standard. So to say, like, I'm elitist and I don't really believe that that was what was needed, but then to also say welcome audiences, you're talking out of two sides of your mouth, and people aren't going to trust your intentions if that's the way that you frame it.
And you know, a lot of people have asked, and one of our questions earlier was, how do we actually gauge? How do you and I know that we're being successful at the kinds of things we're talking about? Because you and I are really kind of bottom line driven, right? We don't want to be wasting our time.
Right.
And so for me, it really is, let me just look in who's at the table, who's part of the conversation, who's really being paid as an employee. You know, it's not just a kind of program that's bringing in funding. It's at the most substantive level. How are these decisions being made? What about you? How do you judge success on these ideas?
I think that when you find, at least from a multicultural background, people of color are feeling comfortable in a space, either they're attending or they're wanting to work there and there's not a lot of high turnover, that's a good sign. When you find yourself in a room where not everyone is white, where there's people of different abilities and orientations and races, that's a good sign. I think just being proactive from an institutional perspective, being proactive so that you're establishing trust and reciprocity with various audiences that you're trying to serve, that's a good sign. So you're kind of looking for these indicators, these signs of life, if you will, of this is what inclusive recruitment or this is what inclusive programming can be. And I think once you see that, you keep with that trend.
Now, another question we just got from Twitter, and it's an interesting one because as museum anarchist, right, I get this question all the time. And the question is, museums have a fundamental obligation to take care of their objects. Is that totally out of date? And so yeah, see, so I get this all the time. You know, when I talk about tactility and immersion and engagement, a lot of people, more traditionally minded people, think that what I mean is I don't love objects. I also get that when we're trying to think about inclusion of different communities, that, well, we don't have those objects. What about the objects we have? What's your thought? What's your experience with that as a question?
You know, I don't think that objects have to be a polar opposite to audience. I think it can be yes and. So yes, museums should take care of their objects, and nothing is trying to stop that. Also, museums need to make their objects and ideas and archives accessible and draw in new audiences as part of their mandate to be a public serving institution. So objects is the start, but not the end goal. You're not just there for the object.
I agree. One thing that I've also found is because you and I have been in the back rooms and looked through the collections,
right?
There's a lot of objects that aren't interpreted, and if you really push, there are objects in there that could tell a much more full story of the interpretation.
Yes. Like mining the museum, that historic, you know, that was done. So yes.
I remember when I was talking, one of the water cooler chats was with Eileen Frank, and she talked about, I was asking her about symbolism, and she talked about them having a Confederate flag that was brought back by a Union soldier, and they had conversations as to whether or not it should be displayed or how it should be displayed, how it should be interpreted. Of course, that brings in the whole Take 'em Down NOLA, with the group that really wants to have the statues and the Confederate symbols removed from public spaces. I interviewed the gentleman there.
It's
it's really kind of a fascinating idea of the intersection of what we do, and in my case, it's mostly historic sites and house museums, right? And you wouldn't normally think that those would have much to say about today. But I just wrote a post of One Night Stand where I'm watching Hillary Clinton's speech, and right above the computer is a picture of Jefferson Davis, and there's a bust on the table of Robert E. Lee. And I'm thinking to myself, this is a pretty kind of profound moment about how our historic spaces and cultural organizations can directly have meaning for what's happening today.
And speaking about how society is advancing, you know, museums have to learn how to do inclusive interpretation, but they have to do the inner work before they even start that to make sure they're an inclusive workplace. So it all ties together. You can't just hire one black face and say, okay, we did diversity, we're done, we're good, put us in the annual report. It's not enough.
Thank you, Monica.
You're welcome.
Hey, Frank and Monica, thank you so much for such a rich dialogue. We're getting towards the end of our time here for our Google chat. So I was just wondering if the two of you had some sort of final thoughts, words of wisdom, ideas, resources for people. Monica, in particular, you know, some of the resources you shared with me when I was looking for inclusive hiring practices, some of that work you're doing through Museum View, I think would be useful sharing. But just some final thoughts would be great.
Sure. I would encourage everyone who works in an institution to really be authentic in your aims for community engagement, to be transparent in your diversity goals for staffing, and realizing that multicultural audiences exist. They go to the movies, they go to the mall, they can come to your museum. They're not hard to find. And diversity isn't a problem to be solved, but more so a strategy to be consistently implemented and a way of working and thinking. So I would hesitate to have people tokenize one Black person, one Latino or Asian person and say, we have our diversity, but continue in your efforts to bring that more and more into the DNA of your institution.
And now I'm going to address what you just said from the perspective of someone who's been leading organizations and who's been hearing a lot or seeing tokenism. From my perspective, I just want things to get started. You know, I often get frustrated when someone says, well, I just want to hire the best person. Well, yes, of course, right? Well, except that through my water cooler chats, I'm talking to a lot of best people who are all over this kind of spectrum. And so for me, my ideas are that I know nothing. I come from a place of knowing nothing, and these water cooler chats and the conversations with my friends and my future new friends are just to inform and tell me where we need to go, what our next steps are, because ultimately what I want to do is affect change now. That's my bottom line. There you go, Mark. That's all I have to say.
That's a great note to finish on. I can't thank you both enough for the conversation, for your participation. I mean, this is obviously just an ongoing dialogue. It's been great for me. I mean, to be honest, I'm really just as much of a participant. This is an area I'm just starting to delve into. There's been something great for me in terms of synchronicity. I've been in the process of hiring a fair amount of new staff. So as I've been delving into creating this program and thinking more about these issues, my own hiring practices, it's been really interesting. And just reflecting on something as simple as, you know, I never used to consider that much when I'm looking at a candidate and I'd identify traits that I have myself that I think are great, but realizing that I'm practicing already some sense of bias there, insisting that that is the only necessary trait that would be good for this position. So this has just been, it's been great for me. Thank you so much both for participating. AEM hopes that you continue this discussion on Twitter, and I think a slide just came up, which is for the evaluation, which we hope participants will complete for us. So again, Monica, Frank, thank you so much. We look forward to continuing to collaborate, work together, and creating an inclusive museum field. Okay?
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.